Welcome to the Kinkology Podcast. This is your host, relationship and sex therapist, Kaylee Rose Friedman, and this is your permission slip to stop shoulding all over yourself, let go of shame, and learn to embody your most authentic sexual self. Hello, Lola. Welcome to the Kinkology Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have this conversation. I think we'll probably touch on a lot of really interesting things. I've got your books here.
Thank you.
I love them. I'm so excited to ask you all the questions. For anybody who's just meeting Lola for the first time, Lola Phoenix is an American-born writer living in Stockholm, working within digital marketing while trying to find an agent to represent their fiction work. Ooh, can't wait to see what that's about. Lola is the author of The Anxious Person's Guide to Non-Monogamy with Jessica Kinsley Publishers and the Non-Monogamy Journal, as well as a weekly advice column and podcast called Non-Monogamy Help. Welcome. Thanks for being here. So I'm really curious, I've got this book a long time ago when I was on my own non-monogamy journey, which I'll maybe share a little bit about. And then you came out with the journal portion recently. So I'm curious about that journey, writing the book, and that did you always know you wanted to have a journal with it? And that was always part of the plan, or was it something that people asked for? I'm curious.
So I originally was approached by Jessica Kingsley because of the podcast and the column. And I had noticed that there were a lot of things that I was repeating. And that's I wrote an article that is, I don't know how popular it is, but it's one of my top visits called 13 Things I Wish I'd Learned Before I Tried Non-Monogamy. And I sort of thought, well, why don't I take this and kind of expand on it? Because I did really feel like a lot of people, I think it's normal to have anxiety when you're starting a non-monogamy, because you don't have any cultural scripts for non-monogamy. You're trying something that's brand new. And I think that anxiety is actually the normal response. And I think that that's not necessarily the message that a lot of people get from polyamory resources. I think they're kind of given, it's a little less bad now than it used to be, but I think that they're kind of given an unrealistic expectation that if they read and they absorb all the knowledge, they're going to be immune to feelings. And that's just not how it works. And so when I did the book, it had quite a couple of exercises within it, and I actually put together cards that I was interested in doing, and I approached the publisher after I'd done the Anxious Guide and it had done really well, and I was like, well, I have a card deck, and they were like, I don't know about a card deck, and then I was like, well, maybe I could make it into a journal, because the idea behind it is that, we watch so many different types of media about different monogamous situations, right? And we have kind of a chance when we see that in TV shows and films and stuff like that, we have a chance to think oh, how would I handle that situation? But there's a lot of situations that are semi-common in non-monogamy. Some of them are kind of random and they probably are very rare. But there are a lot of situations, and especially when people have asked me for advice, that I think, I've seen this before, so I totally have recognized. But the shock of that situation, on top of not being able to ask anybody for help because, because everyone in their immediate kind of family and friends circle are monogamous. So they might just be like, well, I don't know how to help you, or your problem is you're polyamorous, right? They can't ask anyone for help. And then on top of that, it not really wanting to mess up their relationship, being really scared, they don't really have the chance to kind of I guess the word for it is cosplay, the kind of scenarios in their head. And what I'm hoping is that by going through this, on your own or with a partner, because I do think sometimes things come up in partnerships, even in monogamy, where you're like, oh crap, I didn't know you thought this way. And I think if you have the chance to go through it, then maybe if it does happen to you, it's not that you're going to be, okay, problem solved, but you'll be a little bit more prepared. And so the shock of the situation won't smack you so hard, hopefully, if you're at least have the chance to be kind of exposed to it beforehand. And that was the idea behind it. So I'm glad that they went forward with it, because I do think that, there's lots of different stuff in here that I've seen multiple times that I know that people would just, you just wouldn't think that it would happen. It doesn't occur to you. So yeah, that's what my hope.
That makes so much sense. And I see that the value in just being exposed to all different stories, because a lot of the times I think when people have experiences that they've never seen other people have or have never heard of, it's not just the anxiety of the situation that they're dealing with. It's also like maybe a lot of shame and fear of not understanding and not like seeing that other people have dealt with this, or that it's quote unquote normal, which I hate that word.
Yeah.
Or
Me too.
we can use typical, I guess. And that just knowing that other people have these thoughts, these experiences, have navigated them successfully just diffuses the anxiety so much. So I think that's so important. I'm curious, what are some of the situations you said you see situations kind of over and over? Maybe there's like a top three sort of like thing that causes experience or dynamic or issue that can cause a lot of anxiety for people, but that you see that's very actually typical. What comes to mind?
I think that one of the things that's really, really common that I think people don't really think about is a common understanding of one relationship agreement or what one thing means. So, and that can be STI risk, that can be what a partner means. Like, what does it mean to be in a relationship? What does it mean to have a girlfriend? Or what does it mean to have a boyfriend? Like, when do you start calling people those types of things? What do you do with those people? And one thing that I think is actually quite funny, and it's kind of fodder for like a rom-com or a sitcom, I think. It's the idea of like, okay, I'm taking my partner out to this location, but I secretly just want that to be for us. But if they take someone else to that location, I have a lot of feelings about it. It's not like I can say, you can't go to this restaurant with anybody else. But at the same time, I have these feelings. What do I do with that? Like, I think things like that, like, that's not something that you would foresee happening necessarily. And I definitely think that, that where I see a lot of people struggle, and what I think is actually not actually a solvable problem, because I don't think that it needs to be solved, but it's where one person has a perception of like what a relationship is, what a relationship means, and what people do in relationships, and the other person has a different perception. And it's not that either person is necessarily wrong, but sometimes people really struggle with that, because I think especially like when you're starting out in polyamory, if you've read a lot, you want to be equitable, right? Like you want to be, everything has to be equal, and you don't want to, that's a really big thing. People, I think it's not as well as the anxiety, it's like doing it right and not, and if you're in a community that's really emphasized some of these things about being, always being egalitarian and never doing anything wrong, you have that kind of added pressure. So I think like there's so many situations where people try to make everything completely and utterly equal rather than necessarily equitable. And that's like quite a common thing that they don't necessarily know that they're going to run into. But then when they run into it, they're kind of stuck, because they're like, well, I've never been in this situation. I've never had to balance multiple people at the same time. I've never had to think about what makes a relationship, because you've kind of coasted on a shared idea of it. So I think it's things like that. Like, it's a lot of, there are some wacky kind of side things that are very random that can happen. But I think it's usually things like those, like just different conceptions. It just makes you think that actually we don't all exist on the same page of what a relationship even means, even though we think we do. And that's where some people, I think, can run into a lot of anxiety if they're running into it in a relationship as a problem before they've even had to think about it before.
So many juicy things that you just said. I know my brain is like firing. I could go in so many directions right now. One thing that really makes sense to me is that in monogamy, because our culture has so many scripts, the lack of intention is not so dangerous. And by that, I mean, like, if we follow the rules that we have been handed subconsciously by all the media that we watch and all of society, there's a shared understanding or expectation that still is actually totally unclear. And I use so many non-monogamy exercises with my monogamous clients because of that reason. But the fallout to misunderstanding, what does it mean to have a boyfriend or girlfriend? Or what does it mean to introduce my person to my family, or what does it mean to have an anniversary? The fallout is less intense because you're in this container that's been created for you, and there's some like sides, built-in sides to that container that you didn't have to make yourself. But in non-monogamy, it sounds like what you're talking about is that idea that there is no container and you have to build it on purpose. And when you don't, things can really deteriorate quickly. And in general, in our society, we really take for granted that we can be using the same language to mean two totally different things in so many life areas on a daily basis. And without that level of checking in, well, like, what does that mean to you? I just had a conversation with a friend where we were talking about dating, who she was dating, and a partner that I was seeing, and we were using the word casual. And then I started to get confused, and I was like, well, wait, like, how are you doing this if you think it's casual? And then we realized, we're using the word casual in two completely different ways. And we had to like sit and define, what does casual mean to you? What does it mean to me? And we had a really lovely, interesting conversation based on that, and learned more about each other and became closer as a result. And so all this work I see people do actually ends up being so amazing for their connection and relationship. But without it,
definitely.
It's really confusing and scary sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
So I loved that you talked about equity and not equality, which is another huge thing that I talk about with clients, especially any kinky clients or people who are playing with power exchange on purpose. I think in the non-monogamy community, there's this ideal that hierarchy is bad, inherently bad, and that you should do everything possible not to have one. But then if you're into kink and BDSM, you actually want hierarchy on purpose. That's kind of the whole point of power exchange. So what have you seen, or what are your thoughts about those two things, and how people can deal with that, maybe tension between that ideal of equality and the desire for power exchange relationships?
So I think this is actually one of the things that I think a lot of people are confused about, because when we say hierarchy, I don't think it's very clear to a lot of people what specifically that means. And it's like ironic that we're literally just talking about people using words to mean different things, right? So I try to explain to people that like hierarchy in terms of when you start out, when we have relationships, when anyone has relationships, we don't think, unless there's something seriously wrong, that like, oh, I love my partner more than I love my family, or I like this friend more than I like that friend. Like, nobody really thinks about it in that way. So really, the concept of hierarchy in that application is actually quite odd to us. Now, we have different situations where, like, if you know someone for a very long period of time and you have a history with them, that is going to have more context for you than someone you just met yesterday. It's not a matter of, like, I like this person more than I like the person I met yesterday, but you have more emotional context. There's more history. And I think that where people get really confused is, especially if they're in a couple and they open up, they want to approach this. They don't want to be unicorn hunters, essentially, or they don't want to try and see another person that they're dating as an exception. So they'll say, like, we don't have a hierarchy, like we love everyone equally. And I don't think that that's inaccurate. But what I will say to people is that we only have 24 hours in a day. That realistically has to be divided in some way. You decide how you divide up your time, or you unfortunately live in circumstances where you don't get much of a decision on that for lots of reasons. If you were to have children, if you were to have multiple children, you had an infant and a teenager, you would allocate more of your time to that infant because that infant needs more of your time, not because you love the infant more than you love the teenager, right? It's like different relationships require different things of you. I don't think it's inherently a problem if you decide, I have a established relationship with someone, we have shared financial assets, or we live together, or we have a kid together. I don't think it's a problem for you to say, I want to spend the majority of my time with that person, and I want to spend this amount of time with other people, as long as you're clear about that. And in general, I think if you have a child, you have a hierarchy because the child should be the number one thing in your life, in my opinion. But I think where people get confused is they don't want to say, I love you less. So they say, I have no hierarchy. But they do. Like sometimes, and it's not even intentional. It's just because they're so used to spending so much time with their partner. A lot of times people who live together assume that being in the same house means that you're spending time together. I would argue it doesn't. But they operate as if they are still monogamous in a sense until someone finds a partner. And then they have to think about time. And they haven't really thought about time. They're more thinking, I equally love everybody. And they need to shift their focus away from, yes, you care about everyone equally. We all care about all humans to a certain extent equally. And nobody's going to think, nobody who doesn't have some serious issues is thinking, oh, I love this person more than I love that person. Like, that's just not how we think. But you are going to have to decide how you allocate your time. And the best way to prevent people from being hurt is to communicate that. So I think that is a big issue with like the word hierarchy. And I think where people get burned is that they come at it. I mean, they're just jerky people also in general, but like there are some people who come at it with this concept of love hierarchy, and then they still practice the time hierarchy, but they've communicated, oh, I don't have a hierarchy, and meant to love hierarchy, but they haven't communicated the time hierarchy. And then they try to keep things equal, and it doesn't really work because they actually don't want it to be completely fully equitable. And that's where I think people run into heartbreak and get pissed off and then think hierarchy in general is the problem. I don't think it's the problem. I think it's a lack of understanding and communication of what you actually mean. And then I think when it comes to kink, like there are certain aspects of that where if you say you want one dom and you don't want any other dom and you want one person to be your dom, I don't think that that's a problem. Essentially, like I don't think that everything has to be fully equitable, because I don't think even in monogamy, every relationship, and I think Esther Perel has talked about this, like it's not always equitable. Sometimes someone's sick, sometimes someone needs more help. Like it's not like you're tallying up the points to see if everything else is equal. It just becomes a problem when it's not reciprocal. So I think like there is going to be some level of hierarchy. But I think if you own that and you're honest with that from the get-go, then I think that is where people are less likely to be hurt, because then people can opt out. Then if you say to someone that you're dating, if you're like, I do kink, but I only do this, this, and this with this partner, and that's my boundary, that's what I decided and that's what I want, they can then decide, okay, well, I want something different, and they can walk away. And it doesn't have to be this kind of situation where you say, well, everything's equal if genuinely you don't want it to be. It's okay if you don't want it to be. Where people, I think, get hurt is when it's not communicated, where people are assuming things and they don't really understand what hierarchy means or how to divide their time. And I think that's where people end up getting hurt. But yeah, I think you are going to run into people who are going to have a problem with that. But I think just be honest, like you're also going to run into people who are not into kink at all. So,
Right.
no matter what, you're going to run into incompatibility, and you might as well, as long as you're fully honest and you know what you want in those situations. But another kind of thing that pops up is when that changes, when you've made those previous agreements and then you decide maybe I don't want that anymore. And that's a different kettle of fish. But I think, communicate it, be straightforward with it, be honest with it, and then you will run into less of a situation, I think, where other people come in with assumptions, you're both coming in with assumptions, and someone gets burned by it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When we disown, I talk a lot about power, and that I work with a lot of people who have ideals and philosophies, who are like liberatory and want equity for everybody and genuinely want to care for other people in a real way. And so, and because we live in a world where power is often abused and misused, there's become this inherent emotional view that power is bad, and we disown our power, and we don't want power because we've seen so many people misuse it that it seems like a bad thing to want power or to have power. We don't want to be associated with that. And what I often talk with people about is that power exists, and we all have some in different ways, and we're all lacking power in other ways. And if we disown our power and pretend that we don't have any because we've decided that it's bad, then what happens is it becomes very pushed into the shadow and unconscious. And then it does end up getting misused because we're not honest with ourselves or other people. If we are disowning the fact that we do have a hierarchy and there is power in the fact that I live with my primary partner, then that's when it does get misused. But when you own it and you communicate it clearly and other people have informed consent and they can consent to the participating in that situation, then it might not always feel good to them. That's a different question though, you know, and then they can make their choices with all the information is what I'm hearing you say. So
exactly.
yeah, that's interesting. And that is something that comes up a lot in power exchange dynamics, whether it's monogamous or non-monogamous, is just that disowning of the power. Like I think a lot of like subs or bottoms will not hold accountability for the choices or the boundaries or lack of boundaries or the communication or lack of communication. And then the top or the dom doesn't have all the information that they need to make good choices. And then things get really murky and yeah, so that's an important topic. So I don't know if off the top of your head, what you were talking about around like that informed consent and people really understanding what they're getting themselves into. Off the top of your head, can you name a few questions or ideas that someone could ask a new partner if that partner already has a primary or is living with someone or they're like wanting to know more about the hierarchy or what's available? Like what kinds of things could they ask about?
I think it's important to ask them like, how much time do you have to give to this relationship? Like, and how much of your time is locked down versus how much of it is negotiable? Because I think that I don't think everyone has to be in a kind of parallel polyamory, more like where they kind of operate in complete separation, or that kitchen table polyamory is necessarily bad, where they kind of are more communal with their partners and metamors. But I think that I really encourage people to focus on the physicality of it, because I do think that, you know, obviously things can be renegotiated. Just because you agree to something in the beginning of the relationship doesn't mean it has to stay the same all the time. But I do think that if you're starting to date someone and you're like, okay, we have Wednesdays is our day, that's always going to be our day provided nothing else happens, then it doesn't really matter what happens on any of those other days. It doesn't really matter, so many of the things that people kind of angst over kind of don't really matter if you have that set time together. So I think establishing that, because I think emotionally, no one's going to be like, well, yeah, I'm never going to love you as much as I love my primary partner. Like nobody, and people don't think that way, like I said. So I think figuring out that, I also think figuring out, like, I would ask them, are there situations where you guys have closed your relationship in response to stress? Because I understand why people close their relationship. I don't think that people try to do that to hurt other people. I think that people think that monogamy is safer. And so they think, well, opening, it does solve the situation in a way. Opening causes them a lot of stress. Closing it gets rid of that stress. So technically, it is solving the problem. However, I tell people I say, yeah, you can do that, but really some of the problems have to be dealt with in that situation, right? Like it's sort of like, if you are, scared to fly a plane, or go get on a plane. Sometimes you're going to have to be on a plane that's flying in order for you to actually fully overcome that. I'm not an expert. Maybe you can say, actually, there's plenty of other ways. But like, I do think that at some point you're going to have to be on a plane that's flying. And my experience with anxiety is always that if I give anxiety an inch, it will take a mile. The more that I cave into it and the more that I go, okay, I'm going to I'm going to respond to the compulsion. I'm going to go, okay, I won't eat this. I had a big anxiety thing about like having an allergic reaction to food. Never had an allergic reaction to anything in my life, but that was in my brain. Like, I'm going to have an allergic reaction. I started avoiding things because I didn't want to have an allergic reaction. And it just got bigger. The more that I avoided one thing, then another thing would be added to it, then another thing, then another thing. The more you try to avoid it by backing away from it, the bigger it gets and the bigger, more fear it seems. So I think unless you're kind of like seeing someone in a way that it doesn't really bother you if they suddenly decide to say, I can't for a while. See if they do that. See if they respond to that, or see if they have that kind of a practice, because I do think I would probably avoid that, just because I feel like, not that they can never be polyamorous, but I feel like if their response to non-monogamy is just to pull the plug whenever they're having difficulties, some of these things have to be solved in situ. Like they can't, and I would try to avoid that. I think I'd also be realistic, because I do think sometimes, again, that concept of like equity, like everything needs to be, or equality, like everything needs to be fully equal. I do think that if I were dating someone for 2 months, I would, even if there was no kind of kink hierarchy, if there was like, even if they didn't live with that partner, I wouldn't expect the same emotional investment or reaction to our relationship as they have with someone that they've been together with for 10 years. I think that sometimes that's a little bit unrealistic to expect. And we kind of have that in monogamy a little bit. Like if you were dating for someone for 2 months in monogamy, you wouldn't expect the kind of commitment from that, or the same level that you would get from a 10-year relationship. And I think when it comes to polyamory, this kind of, for some reason, just disappears. We kind of think that, okay, you treat all partners equally. So theoretically, someone you met 2 months ago needs to be exactly the same as someone you've known for 10 years. I think that you also have to be realistic. Things take a while. And a good really kind of comparison for this as well is that I moved to Sweden. I live in Sweden. A lot of people say that Swedish people are really unfriendly and find it really hard to make friends. I don't think that's because Swedish people are unfriendly. I think that it's because you're moving to a place where people have more or less stayed in the same place. Like very few people have necessarily moved. So they have friends that they've known for a very, very long time. And they already have the time schedule sorted out with them. They already hang out with like their set group of friends. So you working into that is harder. It's not that they don't want to be friends with you. It's not that they're not friendly. It's that they already have this kind of schema of how they relate to other people and the friends they have. And it takes a while. It takes a little bit more time to break through that and to break into that and for them to change up their routine a little bit. So yeah, I think that it's about figuring out like, okay, how much time do you actually have for this? Do you, some people, that's a bad comparison, but their eyes are bigger than their stomach in a relational way. Like they really want to have multiple relationships, but they don't realistically have any time for them. Understanding how much time you have, is that enough time for you? Understanding whether or not they act as a unit and they pull the plug whenever they, that is really important, because maybe some people won't mind. Again, like it can be a thing where you're like, it's, casual in a way I define casual. And if it's suddenly they go, well, I can't see you for 2 months, fine, whatever. But I would want to know that just because I don't like the idea that my relationship is somebody else's decision. Because as well, I also worry that, are they showing this? That's another thing. People forget about privacy. Like, are they showing this other person our text messages? Or, there's lots of reasons to not do that. So I worry about the boundaries around that. And then I think also just being realistic and understanding that it takes a while to build that foundation. And it's okay. Like you may get to a certain point where you're equal in whatever way you're going to like pull out the relationshipometer and like test it. Like, I don't know how you would judge that, but it's just going to take time for you to build that history with one another. And that doesn't mean that they don't care about you. It just takes time.
Yeah. My brain is going to two different places at once. So I'll go to the more like, not esoteric, the less formed thought, and then come back to the more practical, I think, second. But I think I'm looking at all this from an attachment lens. So what I hear you talking about is it takes time to develop secure attachment with a new person, and that it's not about measuring the depth of love. It's about the fact that it simply takes time, because it takes lots of experiences of a person to feel securely attached to them. And then there's also a difference between having a secure attachment and someone being your attachment figure. And I think that's a really important distinction when working with non-monogamy, when dealing with non-monogamous relationships, is that somebody dating might be looking for an attachment figure, which is a little bit more integrated. It's the person you're going to call if you're having a panic attack and expect them to be available for that. Whereas you can have a secure attachment with anybody and they're not necessarily your attachment figure. You wouldn't expect them to come pick you up on the side of the road at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so really understanding, like, do you have space to be someone's attachment figure, or are you just looking for secure attachments? And that's going to be two different roles in the sense. There's a lot of overlap, I'm sure, but yeah, as I hear you talking about that, that's what I was thinking. And I also will share a little bit about my own journey. And it's funny, actually, I picked up your book when I was in a non-monogamous relationship. I don't know how, it's been like 4 years now, I think, since I was exploring that. And it was interesting journey for me because I had this conceptualization, and you talked about it earlier about the airplane example and working through like a phobia, and that like, I'm framing this all in like psychotherapy language, but you're talking about exposure therapy, that you have to have the stimulus and the exposure and the anxiety, and then work through that feeling in order to teach yourself that it's safe. And then that's how you diffuse that fear. For me, that was my conceptualization as I was like working through things and working with my therapist. But over time, I was decompensating. Like, it was those things that were triggers, those charged experiences were getting worse and not better. And then at some point I realized, okay, I'm not actually working with anxiety. I'm working with complex attachment trauma, like PTSD. And I'm just getting triggered, and it's actually reinforcing my trauma, my attachment trauma, and making the problem worse, not better. And so I had to take a step back and look at, oh, like, maybe this is really just not for me and my particular set of issues and challenges and wounding. And like, maybe that could be different at a different point in my life, or with a different partner, or under different circumstances and boundaries. But that was a really hard pill to swallow. And I ended my relationship because I discovered that was an incompatibility where he was not willing to be monogamous, and I needed to be monogamous for my own mental health and well-being. And so it's interesting to figure out what's your threshold, and is that anxiety that you're managing getting better, and is the work productive or not? And so that was interesting because your book was like so helpful, and I could see the wisdom in it, in framing things. But then for me, it wasn't necessarily quote unquote working for me, because it wasn't a good, that relational style wasn't a good fit for me. And so I think there's so much value in like exploring and trying these things. And I think what I'm hearing you talk about is like and this is so personal for every person, like working through things versus like figuring out what boundaries you actually need. And there's a lot of identity wrapped up in that. Like, I want to be a non-monogamous person. I value equity. I value lots of people. I understand that love can be this and this and this. Well, and my psyche and body and nervous system is like, no, thank you.
And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I try really hard, and I take it to heart to not crap on monogamy. I don't like that. And even as a cheeky thing, and I understand that some non-monogamous people do that, and in response to a world that constantly will overtly tell them that they're doing things wrong. I get that, but I try really hard because I think that I don't think it's an evolved state of being. I don't think that it is, that somebody who is non-monogamous is, a better person or even better at handling their emotions than a monogamous person. And I also don't think that monogamy is easy. I don't think any of those things. I think that it's really important. And one of the things that I try to encourage people to think about, because I can't tell someone if polyamory is for them or if non-monogamy is for them. Like, I don't think I can tell them. But I do think, and what I appreciate about your situation that you described is that I think that if non-monogamy is not for you, then closing and opening actually drags that out way, way more. And I think that, you have to, I think it's better to go with it, see if it's not for you. I think there's an element of sitting in discomfort, but I also think that there's an element of, you know what, it's like I compare it to living in the city or living in the country. Like for some people, they don't want to live in the city. They're not going to be happy there no matter what. They can try and like make it livable, but they're not going to be happy there. And some people are not going to be, they're not going to be happy living in the country. It's just a different way of doing things. And I try to kind of gauge people's willingnesses. I actually have like a little quiz that I have on my website of like to help people figure out. And one of the things that I think is really important is thinking about like, how much time do you want with your partner? Like, do you want the majority of their time? Because theoretically, you could have no emotional problem with the concept of your partner dating or being with somebody else, but you want more of the time. And I think it's something that I ask people is like, could you be in a monogamous relationship with someone who had a time-intensive career, who wasn't home a lot? And that can sometimes lead you into think, oh, maybe actually I do want more of my partner's time. And there are certain like ways of doing non-monogamy that could be more suited. Maybe you could never be solo polyamorous, but you can be hierarchical because that works for you. Or you can do what like Dan Savage talks about, which is like polyamory, which is like you tolerate it. It's not like your thing, but and I think there's lots of different ways. I don't think it always has to be this sort of like equitable, perfect sort of I'm happy. I always really fight against that. I think we're getting more now into an acceptance that like, okay, not everyone's going to be thrilled and happy and joyful all the time. And that's okay. Like it's a little bit better now than it used to be. But I still think that like ultimately it's down to the people involved. If there's a situation where they feel like, you know what, it's a polyamory situation. It's not polyamory under duress, but I'm not thrilled about it either. It's a lot of complexity. And I think, there are lots of reasons why it just isn't for some people. And I definitely don't want to be one of the people that encourages people to think that it's a fault in them that means that polyamory isn't, because it's not. Like sometimes it's just not for you, and that's okay. Like sometimes kink isn't for some people. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. That doesn't mean they can't negotiate. That doesn't mean that they don't trust their partner. It's just not for them. And I think that more like I try really hard and I try to avoid any kind of messaging like that, and anything that I do that sort of makes it seem like monogamy is less than, because I tell people like go back to it if it's something that you want. And I'd rather people do that. And I'd rather people find that out as soon as they can than drag it out by like opening and closing and opening and closing. Because I think that that's just more painful at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for saying all that. Very affirming. I feel validated. It's interesting to navigate all of this. And I'm thinking about now, like, within non-monogamy and kink dynamics and power exchange, and how complex some of that can get, because sometimes a kink dynamic can affect usually the sub or the bottom's other relationships. And I know that's like a big no-no or we're trying to avoid that as much as possible in non-monogamy, that one relationship would kind of trickle into the boundaries or the connection of another relationship. And I'm just thinking about like, if a dom wants to put a sub in chastity, well, that's not going to work necessarily with the other partners. And so like what wisdom do you have for people when they're navigating or negotiating about that? I would imagine that the negotiation has to include everybody in some way.
I think, firstly, I would really encourage people to kind of step away from the idea that like relationships exist in kind of their own echo chambers and they're not affected by others, because they absolutely 100% are. Like no matter how parallel you want to be, there are going to be certain things that are, even not even relationships, your job. Like if you lose your job, that is going to impact all of your relationships in a huge way. If you decide, your job wants to move you to another location and you don't have a choice in that. So there's so many things in our lives that actually directly impact our relationships that I think it's somewhat unreasonable to expect every relationship to exist in its own little echo chamber. I do think that I think that when it comes to negotiating something like that and like chastity or similar kind of things, I think that there's an element of, how real does it have to be? And I think that that's the fun thing that can happen with kink. Like I've seen other situations as well where sort of the idea, like some people have that kind of almost like a cheating fantasy. and if they want to have an open relationship, technically it's not cheating. So then is it still really the same fantasy? I mean, I think, do you have to does everything have to be real, real, real? Do you know what I mean? Can it not be part of the play without affecting it? That's the first thing I'd ask is like, okay, yeah, you want to say you're not allowed to do this, that, and the other thing, but can you accept that they might do it with the other person? But then, it depends on what the point of that kink act is. Like if it does physically affect some other things, then maybe there's an issue. But I think can it be a play? Can it not? Does it have to be real, real, real? I think that's the first thing. I think that you can pretend, as you do in a lot of kink. We pretend. There's a lot of pretend there already. You're not really being violated in those. So like, can we pretend? Just extend the pretend a little bit. And then I also think that there are other aspects of that if you know that that's a thing that you do, then you can also talk to other partners. And I don't think what I really like to do with people when they're experiencing something that they feel is really tied to a specific partner, right? Because it's very easy to blame a metamor or get mad at a metamor and not get mad at your partner. And it's also very easy as the person who has to tell someone no to be like, well, my partner's said this, so I can't really help it, even though it is actively your decision. I think that what I'd encourage people to think about is, what if you couldn't have sex with your partner because they had a yeast infection? Like, not a fun example, but that is a situation where that could have happened from another relationship. You don't know. But that's a situation that would affect your life together, but it's not emotionally charged. If your partner can't have sex, maybe they slipped and fell and they hit their face and they don't feel sexy and they just don't feel like it. You don't immediately think, oh, this is because of another relationship. I feel emotional about it. You think, okay, well, that sucks, but it is what it is. So can you take the emotional power out of that by seeing it? Like if okay, I have a partner who likes to do this, likes to practice this, likes to say, I can't have sex for this period of time or something like that. Can I make my other partners aware beforehand so that they have informed consent that there might be occasions where I'm not able to have sex? And it wouldn't really be that different than maybe you have intensely bad periods and you literally can't get out of bed for a week. Like it's not really any different. Sometimes there are time periods when we're not going to be able to do the things that we want to do. So can you take the emotion out of it by giving them informed consent and just saying use a safe word if you don't want it to be emotionally charged, or you can pretend. You can just pretend like you're having a really, really bad stomach ache or really bad, whatever kind of gastrointestinal issue you want to pretend you have. Like you can say, I've got that now. Now's not the time. And then you can pretend, then you take the emotion out of it. So I think it's just about trying to work with those things. And, sometimes I also think that, you need to talk with a partner about this to make sure that they're okay. But I think sometimes, you don't have to share all of the information in a way. Like if you can say you don't feel no is a complete sentence. So you don't have to have a reason to say no in this particular situation. So no is a complete sentence, and you can simply not say, well, I've made this agreement with another partner that I won't have sex for 7 days or something. You can't just say no, and that should be fine. But yeah, it's just about negotiation. And I think, being really honest. And also I think, it's okay for a partner if you have a kink dynamic with one partner and you don't have that kind of a dynamic with another partner. And that can be a source of kind of fear for them. And that's okay. I think where I've had that is I've never been a very adventurous party person. I'm not a very big social butterfly. I've always dated people who are massive social butterflies who love going to parties. And it's always been a big thing, a bit of an anxiety thing for me. I'm like, oh, I'm not fun enough. I'm a wet blanket. I'm not exciting enough. I know they're going to find someone who's a party person and I'm not cool enough. And so that can be, you can feel that way. You're like, oh, I'm vanilla and I'm not good enough. It can be really hard. But I think that allowing them to feel that way and not brushing it off and being like, oh, it's not about that. They're going to feel that way. That's okay. And there might be something special that you can share. And when I've had that experience with partners and I've been like, oh, I've been honest with them. I'm like, I don't like to go to these parties. And I've had partners say look, I don't go to parties with you. You're not the partner that I have that I go to parties with. We do these other things. These other things are fun to me too. It's not that fun comes in one flavor. I also like doing this. These are the things that I do with you. And I've even had partners do things like, you're the only person that I'm going to go to amusement parks with. I don't care. I don't care about amusement parks, but like, there are things that you can do if that becomes an issue that can help out. But yeah, I think ultimately it just comes down to like being really clear about communication and trying really hard to like, it's not necessarily that one thing takes over the other. It's not necessarily about, own your decisions. Don't be like, oh, I can't do it because obviously if you're a sub, it's kind of like, I can't do it because someone told me I can't. But you have agreed to that dynamic.
Right.
So own that you've agreed to that dynamic and own those decisions and be willing to stand in them rather than allowing the metamor to be blamed for it.
Yeah, a lot of what I'm hearing that, throughout that your messaging is really about taking the charge out of the meaning that we make out of a lot of this, like taking the judgment out of it, the shame out of it, that it should be this way or it should be that way, and just like this radical acceptance that this is how it is. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, because I do think that some of the problem comes from the meaning we attach to it. It doesn't have to have that meaning. We get to decide that, actually. It may not feel that way sometimes when you're like in your feelings, but you actually can decide what meaning you choose to give to things like that.
Yeah. I love all of this for even monogamous folks. Like all of these questions, reflections, all the stuff in the journal, like boundaries and the structure of your relationship. And everybody can benefit from reflecting on all of these topics and from really asking ourselves, what is the meaning that we're making about all these different expectations and rules? And you said no to this, so now I'm rejected. Like, are you really rejected, or is that the story you're telling yourself? And there's so many so much juicy information about how we see ourselves and the world in all of that reflection. If you could wave a magic wand and everybody in the world would read your books or use some of your tools, what would you want people to sort of take away about relationships in general?
I think that one thing that, I can't say it's necessarily originally my thought because it's something that I've learned over time, is really understanding the connection between like your nervous system and how that creates a reaction in you that you can actually control to a certain extent. I have attributed this to Viktor Frankl, but actually found out through my research that it wasn't actually him who said this, but there's a quote that says like, between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space lies our freedom. And I think that it's even more so difficult now because I do think there are a lot of well-meaning communities that teach people that there is no space between stimulus and response. And actually the bigger response you have, the more moral you are, the better you are. That demonstrates how much you care. But actually, we have a lot more power than we really think that we do. And being able to kind of understand that your nervous system is not your enemy. Your brain is not your enemy. You're not fighting against, yourself. That was like the biggest thing for me in terms of like shifting. I would still say I have anxiety, but I would say I have a normal human level of anxiety on a day-to-day basis, and I don't have the same amount that I used to have, like having panic attacks every day. Like that's not a thing. And I think a lot of that came from self-compassion, as well as instead of seeing my nervous system and seeing my brain as like, okay, it's this enemy, it's this sort of, at first it was like this Sisyphus boulder, and every time I had a panic attack, it was like the boulder was rolling back on me. And then it was like, oh, it's this like demon inside of me that like is going to haunt me forever, and I'm completely helpless against it. And in some ways, thinking of it that way helped because then it wasn't my fault. It wasn't that I was dropping the boulder. But then the next sort of stage was like, okay, this is actually me. This is me trying to protect myself. This is me responding to things because it's used to responding in certain ways. And that way has served me in the past. It's just not serving me now. And I think that monogamous people, polyamorous people, like all people, if we can kind of understand that, okay, the way that you're responding to something emotionally generally comes from survival. It generally is, you can't really learn when you're in your activated, scared state. And that's something that I've also learned from like child development. Like I followed a lot of like gentle parenting creators and like brain-based, all that sort of stuff. And even though I'm not a kid, I think that's still applicable to adults. Like we can't learn very well when we're in an activated state. And the more that we can understand, like, okay, I have a choice and how I respond to things. I have a choice in being able to step back, being able to breathe, and be more curious about that. I think that would help so many people tremendously because I think we aren't taught to do that. And it's nobody's fault. It's not like they're doing it because they're trying to be a jerk. But I think you're trying to survive. You're using the same adaptive techniques that you've used that have served you in the past, or maybe kind of just helped you survive, and now they're not helping. And so, yeah, I think that understanding like the nervous system, that it's not your fault, that it's your brain is reacting in a certain way, and then being able to have compassion for yourself for that, I think is a huge step. Because I know there's a lot of problems with the phrase, like, if you can't love yourself, how can you love anybody else? I understand the criticisms of that phrase, but I do genuinely feel like it is harder to extend compassion to other people if you have no compassion for yourself, because yourself is sort of like the baseline of how you treat other people. And once you start to treat yourself a little bit better, you build that trust within yourself. You make choices where you don't betray yourself. You are able to set your boundaries. You are able to advocate for yourself, and you see that happening again and again. Then you also kind of understand that other people, when they are acting in not such a great way, like, they're probably trying to survive. They don't trust themselves. Like, you start to have compassion for other people. And I think that makes life in general a heck of a lot easier, because it's not so much about like everything's terrible. It's kind of like that meme of like the one person on the side of the bus looking at the wall that's miserable, and then the other person on the other. It's kind of like that. Like, you can sit on which side of the bus you choose to sit on, actually. And I do think that if people could just kind of grasp that understanding a little bit, and get that it's not so much about willpower, and but it's about understanding how your brain works, I think that it would probably help a lot of people out in so many different ways.
You heard it here, folks. Heal your trauma. Straight from Lola Phoenix's mouth. Go to therapy, heal your trauma, do your inner work, understand yourself better, understand your nervous system, and your relationships will get better. No big deal. Yeah, I would love to go around and sprinkle fairy dust on everybody in the world. They could wake up the next morning and be trauma informed, and then it would solve all of our problems in humanity. That's my theory.
Yeah, I think conflict is to a certain extent inevitable, but I think we would probably navigate it a lot better if we were able to understand how we react to things.
Agree so hard. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Tell the people where they can find you. What are you up to?
So you can find all the information about my books and everything at non-monogamyhelp.com. I'm also on lots of different social media platforms, not as much X anymore because it's a pain in my butt, but it's Non-Monogamy Help on X and Non-Monogamy Help on Instagram. I wish I had picked a more snappier name, but I just didn't want to pick like a poly something, because I was like, I'm tired of poly everything. That's, anyway. And then also I'm actually, because of all of the kind of advice that I see that I keep kind of giving to people when they're looking to open up, I'm actually putting together a course for people, because I really genuinely believe the advice that gets given to people when they want to open their relationship or they want to try non-monogamy is like, here's 5 books, read for 6 months, do what I call the polyamory PhD, which I feel like it's not bad to read. Like, obviously as an author, I'm not going to say don't read books. That would be stupid. But like, there's so many things that you can implement right away that you don't have to wait 6 months for. So I'm putting together like a course for people that's like self-paced. They can do it, like it's audio based as well. So like it's not a lot of reading, but it has a lot of exercises and that they can do to, like, if they want to open up, to like actually get started rather than just like, waiting for 6 months and seeing what happens. So that is something that's also on non-monogamyhelp.com. But yeah, you can find pretty much everything on that site, and feel free to send me a question if you'd like. I do the advice column, like I said, once a week, and then usually take a break between every 10 episodes. But yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I will put all those links in show notes, and I appreciate your time, and that was such a great conversation, and hopefully we'll do this again.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
I have a few asks for you. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to it so you don't miss any of these juicy conversations. If you enjoyed the episode, as always, rate and review it. If you didn't enjoy it, keep it moving. Share the episode with one friend or partner, and let's keep this conversation going. Follow me on Instagram at Kinkology Pod. Thank you for listening. And remember, you deserve to live boldly, love deeply, and kink authentically. Stay curious, friends.